At the age of 20, Grace found herself alone on the bustling streets of New York, without money, family, and holding a newborn baby in her arms. She had fled an abusive relationship, leaving everything she knew behind in an attempt to build a better life for herself and her son, Tom. However, the promises of a bright future quickly turned into cold nights and hopeless days. Grace wandered the streets, trying to find a job, but no one wanted to hire a young mother with no experience. She spent nights in overcrowded shelters, where Tom's cries were muffled by the sounds of other unfortunate souls. Each day seemed more desperate than the last, with guilt and despair mounting. One particularly cold night, sitting on a park bench, Grace looked at Tom, who was sleeping in her arms, and realized she could not continue this way. She knew her son deserved more than the life she could provide at that moment. With tears streaming down her face, she made the most difficult decision of her life. Grace found an old church with large, welcoming doors. With trembling hands, she placed Tom in a basket, wrapped him in his warmest blanket, and left a letter explaining her situation, asking for forgiveness and begging for him to be taken care of. She rang the bell and stepped back, hiding in the shadows to ensure someone would come for her son. As she saw the doors open and a figure appear, Grace stifled a sob and quickly walked away, disappearing into the night. Tom was taken inside the church, while Grace, devastated, walked through the dark streets, now directionless, but with the hope that her son would have a chance at a better life. Tom was found in the basket in front of the church and quickly taken to an orphanage. The early years of his life were a blur of unfamiliar voices and curious glances. He grew up within the gray walls of the orphanage, where affection was rare and routines were harsh. Yet, despite everything, Tom was a resilient boy. He learned to walk, talk, and laugh, even when his heart longed for something he couldn't name. At the age of 5, Tom's life took a turn when the Johnsons, a loving and kind family, decided to adopt him. Tom found a new home with them, a place filled with laughter, bedtime stories, and warm hugs. But even surrounded by love, he felt a deep restlessness. His nights were often disturbed by confusing dreams and a sense of emptiness he couldn't understand. As Tom grew older, this restlessness only increased. He noticed the differences between himself and his adoptive parents, in appearance, mannerisms, and the childhood stories they shared. During family gatherings, he saw other children hugging their grandparents and wondered why his own story was such a mystery. On one birthday, while everyone else celebrated, Tom hid in his room, clutching the only memento he had of his past, the letter left by Grace. The words, blurred by time but still legible, echoed in his mind. Who was this woman who loved him enough to leave him? Why did she abandon him? By the age of 10, Tom's curiosity had turned into a silent quest for answers. He asked his adoptive parents questions, which they always answered patiently but with little information. He became more introspective, observing the world around him with questioning eyes. Each new detail he uncovered about his origins only fueled his desire to learn more. The lack of clear answers led to a growing internal frustration, a feeling of incompleteness. He began to understand that to find peace, he would need to confront the past that had been taken from him. But before he could take further steps towards the truth, adolescence awaited him, bringing with it new challenges and conflicts. Adolescence hit Tom like a storm. The curious and introspective boy gave way to a rebellious and furious young man. The frustration accumulated over the years manifested in bouts of anger and acts of defiance. He became increasingly distant from the Johnsons, his adoptive parents, who desperately tried to understand what was happening to their beloved son. At school, Tom was constantly getting into fights. The anger he felt from not knowing his true origins made him explode at the slightest provocation. Every punch he threw was an attempt to release his internal pain, but nothing seemed sufficient to fill the void. The teachers saw in him an intelligent but lost boy, unable to control his emotions. At home, the situation was no different. The arguments with his adoptive parents became frequent and intense. They tried to calm him down, offering support and understanding, but Tom withdrew more and more. He felt that no one could understand what he was going through, that no one knew what it was like to grow up without knowing his true roots. In his room, on silent nights, Tom would face Grace's letter. He read it repeatedly, seeking in the written words some clue, some consolation. "Why did you leave me?" he murmured to himself, feeling a lump in his throat and tears of frustration running down his face. The letter was a constant reminder of the abandonment and the unanswered question that tormented him. His search for identity led him down dangerous paths. Tom started getting involved with the wrong people, seeking in risky adventures a way to forget his pain. Nights were spent at parties, consuming alcohol and drugs, trying to drown the feeling of abandonment that seemed to grow each day. The Johnsons, despite their worries, did not give up on Tom. They tried different approaches, advice from friends, professional help, but nothing seemed to penetrate the armor he had built around himself. Tom was lost, navigating a sea of confused emotions with no direction. Then, in a moment of extreme desperation and anger, Tom made a decision that would change everything. He left home, determined to find answers on his own, to discover the truth about his biological mother and understand why he had been left behind. Tom left home with fierce determination. He vowed to himself that he would find the answers he had been searching for. Over the following years, he channeled all his anger and frustration into his studies. He immersed himself in books and dedicated himself tirelessly, as if each academic achievement could fill a bit of the emptiness he felt. Finally, his efforts paid off. Tom graduated with honors and quickly landed a job at a prestigious tech company in New York. To the world, he was a brilliant and promising young man. But inside, the battle continued. He worked long hours, often to the point of exhaustion, trying to avoid painful thoughts about his past. Professional success came quickly. Promotions, awards, recognition, it all seemed perfect. But as he climbed the career ladder, Tom felt increasingly isolated. He avoided intimate relationships, keeping everyone at arm's length. Loneliness was his only constant companion. The nights, once filled with parties and escapism, were now spent in a luxurious but empty apartment. In moments of silence, Tom found himself confronted by the same feelings of abandonment and doubt that had plagued him since childhood. He looked at Grace's letter, now stored in a drawer, and wondered if he would ever understand why he was left behind. The frustration transformed into a dull ache, eating away at him from within. His colleagues admired him, but also feared his intensity. Tom was known for being relentless, both with himself and with others. He demanded perfection, perhaps hoping that achieving excellence in everything would finally bring him the peace he so desperately sought. But instead, success only seemed to highlight the emptiness in his heart. One day, after a particularly stressful meeting, Tom found himself staring out at the city through his office window. The bright lights of New York reflected in his eyes, but he felt distant, disconnected from everything around him. The loneliness was overwhelming, and he realized that the success he had achieved meant nothing without understanding his own past. Then, on impulse, he decided it was time to confront his demons once and for all. Tom knew that to move forward, he needed to discover the truth about his biological mother, about Grace, and finally understand why she had abandoned him. With a heavy but determined heart, he began to plan his search for the truth. Tom began his search for the truth with an intensity that surprised even himself. He scoured archives, visited adoption agencies, and asked painful questions to people who preferred to forget. In one of these searches, he found Sarah, a woman who had known Grace many years ago. Sarah was reluctant at first, but seeing the desperation in Tom's eyes, she agreed to talk. In a cozy cafe, between sips of hot coffee, she began to tell her story. Grace was a good person, but she was completely lost, Sarah said, her voice soft but laden with painful memories. She loved you, Tom. It was the hardest decision of her life. Every word Sarah spoke felt like a blow to Tom's heart. The image of his biological mother began to take shape, not as the villain he had imagined for so many years, but as a desperate young woman fighting against the circumstances. This revelation brought a new wave of emotions: confusion, pain, and a strange kind of understanding. Sarah continued, explaining how Grace had been haunted by her past and had done everything to protect Tom. She believed abandoning you was the only way to give you a chance, Sarah explained, her eyes filled with sadness. Tom left the cafe with his head spinning. He finally had a glimpse of the truth, but it only raised more questions. He knew he had to find Grace, confront her, and hear her side of the story. With a new sense of urgency, Tom intensified his search, using every resource at his disposal. Then, one day, a lead took him to a hospital. He walked in, his heart pounding, almost expecting it to be another false lead. But when he entered the indicated room, he saw a frail woman lying in the bed. Grace's eyes slowly opened, and when they met Tom's, both of them knew immediately. The reunion was silent, filled with emotions that no words could describe. Grace tried to sit up, but she was too weak. Tom, still unsure of how to feel, approached with hesitant steps. He felt a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, compassion. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. Grace extended a trembling hand and, in a weak voice, began to speak. "Tom, I'm so sorry." The words barely left her mouth before she started to cry. Time seemed to stand still as Tom looked at the woman he had been searching for all his life. But before they could really begin the conversation that would change their lives, the emotion in the room became overwhelming, leaving Tom unable to decide whether to listen or leave. Tom left the hospital room with his head spinning. The brief encounter with Grace had left him stunned. He was so close to getting answers, but the pain and emotion in his biological mother's eyes had disarmed him. He needed time to process everything, but he knew time was not on his side. Over the following days, Tom drifted in a sort of stupor, thoughts wavering between his work and the urgent need to confront Grace again. He avoided friends and colleagues, spending sleepless nights reliving the brief encounter and trying to imagine what to say when he returned to the hospital. Finally, he decided he couldn't wait any longer. He returned to the hospital, this time determined to hear everything Grace had to say. When he entered the room, the scene was the same. Grace lying in bed, frail, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her, holding her trembling hand. Grace began to speak, her voice a whisper laden with years of regret. "Tom, I know you must hate me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But please let me explain." She told the story of her youth, how she had fallen madly in love with a man who promised the world but quickly turned into a nightmare. "I was scared, alone, and when you were born, I knew I couldn't protect you from that world," Grace said. "Leaving you was the most painful decision of my life, but I believed it was the only way to give you a chance to survive." Tom listened in silence, every word from Grace tearing at his heart. He felt a mixture of compassion and anger, trying to reconcile the image of the young, frightened mother with the woman who had abandoned him. Painful memories of his childhood and adolescence flooded back, but he also felt a new understanding emerging. "I always wanted to find you. Always," Grace continued, her voice firmer. "But I was ill, and time passed. I never stopped thinking about you, Tom. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Tom, his voice choked with emotion, finally spoke. "I grew up with questions, Grace. I grew up with anger and pain, not knowing why I was abandoned. But now, I don't know what to feel." Grace squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with infinite sadness. "I understand, my son. I just want you to know that I've always loved you. I never stopped loving you." The emotion in the room was palpable. Tom felt a wave of relief mixed with the pain of the past. He didn't have all the answers, but he was beginning to feel that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness was possible. But before he could decide, the nurse entered, informing them that the visit needed to end. Tom stood up, promising Grace that he would come back the next day. He left the hospital with a heavy heart, but with a newfound determination. He needed to continue this conversation, to face every emotion, and perhaps, finally find the peace he had been searching for. Tom returned to the hospital the next day, his heart pounding. He entered Grace's room with steady steps, but inside, a storm of emotions raged. He was determined to listen to everything, to understand his story completely. Grace was waiting, her face illuminated by a weak but genuine smile. She seemed even more fragile than the day before, the shadow of illness evident in every movement. Tom approached, sat beside her, and held her hand again. "I'm here, Grace. Let's continue. Grace took a deep breath and began to recount the painful details of her life. She spoke about the man who had destroyed her, about the constant violence and fear. She told how, upon discovering her pregnancy, she had decided to flee, hoping to protect her son from that toxic environment. "I wandered aimlessly for months, trying to find a safe place for us," she said, her voice trembling. "But the world was not kind to me. When you were born, Tom, I looked at you and knew you deserved something better than I could offer." A tear trickled down Tom's cheek as he listened. Grace's words resonated with a pain he had never imagined. She had suffered as much as he had, perhaps even more. "I never imagined you had gone through all that," he said, his voice choked. "I always thought you simply didn't want me." Grace squeezed his hand tighter. "I loved you from the moment I knew you existed," she said, her voice full of sincerity. "Every day without you was torture. I hope that someday you could understand and maybe forgive me." Tom looked at Grace, seeing not only the mother who had abandoned him, but a woman destroyed by circumstances. He felt the anger and resentment begin to dissipate, replaced by a profound empathy. "I want to try to understand, Grace. I want to try to forgive." Grace smiled, tears glistening in her eyes in the dim light of the room. "That's all I could ask for, Tom. Thank you." The conversation continued, each word revealing more about the past, filling the voids Tom had carried for so long. He realized that forgiveness would not be immediate, but the process had begun. Each story Grace told was a brick removed from the wall of resentment he had built. But then, in the midst of a painful memory, Grace began to cough violently. Tom called the nurse quickly, panic growing inside him. The nurse rushed in, helping Grace calm down. Tom stayed by her side, holding her hand, feeling the fragility of life before him. The nurse looked at Tom with a compassionate gaze. "She needs to rest now," she said, her voice soft but firm. Tom nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He leaned in, kissed Grace's forehead, and whispered, "I'll be back tomorrow. I promise." He left the room, feeling the weight of the day's emotions. He knew time was against them, but he was determined to continue. The reunion was painful but necessary, and for the first time in a long time, Tom felt a spark of hope. Tom returned to his apartment, but his mind was far away. Grace's revelations echoed in his thoughts, mingling with memories of his childhood and adolescence. He felt like a ship adrift in a sea of emotions, anger, compassion, sadness, and a strange sense of relief. In the days that followed, Tom went to the hospital every day. Each visit was a deeper dive into the emotional storm brewing inside him. Grace told more stories, each one more painful than the last, and Tom began to understand the magnitude of the sacrifice she had made. But even with this understanding, forgiveness was not easy. The pain of abandonment was still an open wound, and each word from Grace was a bomb that burned before healing. One afternoon, while sitting by Grace's bedside, Tom finally exploded. "Why didn't you try to find me earlier? Why did you wait so long?" The anger in his voice was undeniable, a mix of pain and frustration accumulated over decades. Grace, with tears in her eyes, responded with a trembling voice. "I tried, Tom, but life wasn't kind to me. I was sick, alone, and without resources. Every day was a struggle for survival." Tom felt a mixture of anger and pity. "You don't know what it was like to grow up not knowing who you were, feeling like a part of me was missing." He stood up, unable to contain the emotion consuming him. "I spent my whole life trying to be perfect, thinking that somehow it would bring you back." Grace was crying now, the sound of her sobs filling the room. "I know, my son, and it breaks me every day. If I could go back, I would do everything differently. I'm so sorry, Tom. Please forgive me." Tom's internal battle was visible. He wanted to forgive her, but the pain was too deep. He sat back down, his hands trembling. I don't know if I can, but I want to try." They sat in silence for a long time, just holding each other's hands. Tom knew that forgiveness was a process, not an instant act. And for the first time, he was willing to take the first step. But before they could continue, the nurse entered, advising that Grace needed rest. Tom nodded, kissed his mother's forehead, and promised to return the next day. He left the hospital feeling exhausted, but also slightly lighter. He knew the journey was just beginning, but each day brought a new hope. Tom returned to the hospital the next day with a mixture of determination and fear. Each step towards Grace's room was heavy, laden with uncertainty about how he truly felt. When he entered the room, he found Grace weaker than before, but with a sparkle in her eyes upon seeing him. "Hi, Tom," she said, her voice weak but warm. "Hi, Grace," he replied, sitting by her bedside and holding her hand. His mother's weakness hit him like a blow, reminding him that time was precious. Grace began to speak again, trying to share more about her life and the reasons behind her choices, but Tom gently interrupted her. "Grace, I understand what you went through. I understand the sacrifice. But now, I need to understand what it means for me. I want to forgive you, but that doesn't erase the pain I felt." Grace looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know, Tom, and I don't expect you to forgive me immediately. I just want you to know that I've always loved you, that I've always thought of you." Tom took a deep breath, feeling the weight of emotions within him. He knew he was at the crossroads of his life, where the decision he made now would shape his future. He thought of all the anger, pain, and loneliness he had carried for so long. He thought of the sacrifices Grace had made and the life she had endured. "Grace," he finally said, his voice choked, "I will try. I will try to forgive you. I don't know how long it will take, but I'm willing to try." Grace smiled, tears streaming down her face. "That's all I could ask for, Tom. Thank you." Tom's decision to forgive wasn't easy, and he knew it would be a long and painful process. But seeing the relief and peace in Grace's eyes, he felt he was on the right path. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, sharing stories, and laughing at the small memories Grace still remembered. But then, suddenly, Grace began to have trouble breathing. Tom called the nurse, panic growing within him. The nurses rushed into the room, and Tom was pushed out, watching through the window as they tried to stabilize his mother. He stood there, his heart in his throat, feeling helpless. The doors to the room closed, and he was left alone in the hallway, his mind a storm of thoughts and emotions. Tom waited in the corridor, his heart pounding, as the nurses tried to stabilize Grace. Minutes felt like hours, each second laden with fear and uncertainty. He felt powerless, trapped between the pain of the past and the fragility of the present. Finally, one of the nurses emerged from the room. "You can go in now," she said gently. Tom entered, finding Grace visibly exhausted but still conscious. She tried to smile upon seeing him, and he sat beside her, holding her hand firmly. "I'm here, Grace," he said, his voice full of emotion. Grace took a deep breath, the effort evident. "Tom, I'm so proud of you. You're strong, even when you think you're not. Thank you for giving me a chance to explain." Tears welled up in Tom's eyes, but he remained steadfast. "I'm proud of you too, Grace, for everything you've been through and still finding the strength to love me." Grace squeezed Tom's hand one last time. "You'll be okay, my son. You'll find peace." With those words, Grace closed her eyes, a gentle sigh escaping her lips. Tom felt a pang in his heart as he realized his mother had passed away. He stayed there, holding her hand, tears silently streaming down his face. Hours later, Tom left the hospital, his mind and heart heavy. But along with the pain, he also felt a sense of peace and redemption. He knew that forgiveness would be an ongoing process, but he was ready to move forward. He had found answers, and, more importantly, he had found a path to healing. Tom returned home, feeling slightly lighter, a little freer. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was prepared to face it. Grace had given him the key to peace, and he was determined to use it. As he entered his apartment, Tom looked out the window, seeing the bright lights of New York City. He took a deep breath, feeling the night breeze, and smiled softly. The journey had been tough, but he was ready for a new beginning.